She was at a pitch. She was pitching to a group of investors, and she actually spent most of the time explaining the female anatomy, and she didn't actually get enough time to actually pitch her product.
Very often the story goes like, oh, can we make it an informal pitch at 10 p.m. in a bar? Something that should not be happening, this day and age. But this is like happening right now. I hear this kind of stories all the time because actually there's some research that's shown that in terms of IRR, internal rate of return, and other measures of performance, women-led companies actually outperform men-led companies on average. Yet 98% of venture capital goes to men-led companies. To me, that's the biggest paradox.
Some investments chase returns, others shift reality. Welcome to Blindspot Capital, the show where we trace the capital flows, structural decisions, and invisible forces shaping the future of health. We go deep on what's overlooked, underfunded, or misunderstood, especially where women's health, longevity, and AI intersect. Because this isn't just about the next big trend, it's about who gets seen and who gets funded. All right, so today's episode is a bit of a departure from our usual format. It's a co-hosted deep dive with someone whose work I read religiously when I want the real, unvarnished truth about digital health from an investor's perspective. No fluff, no pitch decks, just signal. I first found Sergei Polevikov on Substack through a piece he'd written about sexism in venture capital. It was sharp. It was honest. Yes, a little bit savage, but with a level of care and insight that you don't find in mainstream analyst notes. And then I came across a piece, Sergei, that you wrote about your mom visiting you over the holidays. And I think for me, that's really when it clicked. I mean, here was someone who was calling out broken systems, separating signal from noise, not with spreadsheets and market caps, but with data and heart. I mean, in a world that's flooded with hype, it's rare to hear from someone who cuts through the noise with perspective, with data, and with a healthy dose of skepticism. So that's what this conversation brings. Not a pitch, just sharper lens. So I messaged Sergei. I misspelled his name in one of my first messages to him. And they say first impressions matter, right? But Sergei, you replied anyway. So, so here we are. Sergei, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Marianne. This is very kind of you. I appreciate all the kind words you're saying. On my side, I honestly enjoy your writing as well. I think you've been one of the loudest voices, especially on investing in women's issues, highlighting disparities between women's and men's issues. That's been very refreshing. So thank you for your work as well.
No, thank you. I think before we get into the heavy stuff, because as I said, it's sharper lens. We're not doing a pitch here today. How did you actually start writing like this? You know, this mix of blunt honesty, data, precision. I mean, you are so precise, but also with enough humanity to make people uncomfortable in a good way.
I'm highlighting a lot of things that I think some people prefer and not to, but I'm also doing it in a respectful fashion, I think,
Yes.
not trying to put anybody on the spot or in disgraceful situation or something like that. But at the same time, just looking at the facts, because I'm a data guy, I'm a mathematician by training. So to me, just when I'm looking at numbers, when I'm looking at everyday situations, and then I'm observing at conferences, especially at various venture capital events, that a lot of things that have been glorified, that have been put on pedestal, that's not really healthcare that I'm observing on a daily basis, talking to clinicians, to nurses, to patients. And that's the reason I started writing, because of this disparity between kind of the real life that I'm observing as a health founder, as previously also an investor, but also just as a person, as a father. And so I'm observing this huge disparity between what people are saying in the media, in the conferences, and what's happening in real life. And I don't know, that's how I started writing. Again, everything I write, I try to support with numbers, with data,
Yes,
to make it credible. In the end of the day, I think the goal is to highlight the problem, but also to suggest solutions and to fix those problems. And in this country, in the United States, we have, unfortunately, a lot of problems, which is amazing, because in so many areas, we have so many great innovators and so far ahead in certain areas, ahead of everybody else. But then healthcare somehow got behind by so much, probably by like 20 years or even more. that's why I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but again, like little by little, talking to people who are in the middle of all this mess, I would say, inside the system, talking to them, trying to get insights, what's happening, why are patients being underserved, why they're not being cared about, what the problems, how we can fix them. And because my background is in technology, in math, I still have this belief that we can fix a lot of these problems with technology if it's used well, if it's used for good. I think this can be fixed. And so I'm on this kind of path to figure out how we can fix all this mess.
Yeah. I mean, you've touched on a couple of things. You've talked about innovation in digital health. I'm going to come to you on that because I want to talk about some of the predictions that you made earlier in the year for 2025. But I think before I go into that, you also mentioned, conferences. You were recently at the Health to Tech conference in New York. And I think for listeners who weren't there, that's something that I would have loved to attend, but it wasn't available online. It's really a physical event. So I think for people like me or for other listeners who weren't there, what were some of the key trends or themes that you took away from that event that maybe felt underappreciated by investors?
Interestingly, in line with the theme of this meeting that we're having right now, the two events that I've been, and Health to Tech, by the way, just to start from the beginning, it's my very good friend and colleague, Alex Koshikov. He single-handedly started those events, and now
Yes.
they're kind of spread across the US. And he has his first event actually in Tel Aviv, so he's he's going international next month. Actually, this month already. It's May 1st. He's gonna have his first inaugural meeting in Nashville, Tennessee. So he's basically going nationally here in the US, which is amazing. Like, how can he even do it by himself? I'm his
Wow.
supporter. I don't pretend I have anything to do with that. I was happy to present his event almost 2 months ago, which was very well taken. I'm so happy he had a record attendance for that event. So anyway, all credit to him. But just in terms of what I've been learning, interestingly enough, last two events were on women's health, and it was two very successful and accomplished women. So it was the event in Philadelphia that I went about a month ago. So there was a talk by Sam Borowski from Maven Clinic. And then last week, it was Jill Miranda from Snatch Health. It was a lot about just sharing their experience and just trying to establish themselves as entrepreneurs. In case of Sam, it was just, grinding and, trying to find yourself and then getting acquainted to this new company, Maven,
Mm-hmm.
and meeting their CEO, Kate Ryder, and sort of having this epiphany that, oh my God, we can do so much in women's health. And then Jill, on the other hand, which was the event in New York last week, Jill Miranda just shared her experience in terms of, okay, so we found ourselves in this very unfair world, unfortunately dominated by men and sort of investment in mental health. But, how can we deal with that? Given the situation, given that a lot of women startups are actually doing very well, but in this sort of scarcity of VC capital, how can we deal with that? How can we navigate? And so she's kind of shared, very gracefully her experience and gave some tips, mainly to starting young women in this field, how to deal with all the situation. I think something she mentioned that it's not only about those top brand names, there are other ways of finding funding and just kind of how you communicate, how you maybe network kind of better, especially as a woman, because it's so challenging. And again,
Mm.
it's funny that I talk about, but still for me, it's great to learn. I have two daughters, and I hope they grow up in a better world than we have right now.
Mm.
Because again, there's just some stories that I hear is just awful. Still, so much discrimination, so many just outright awful stories against women founders, and I'm just kind of fascinated by these women who are continue fighting, and they're success stories, but I wish there were more success stories than that.
Yeah, no, I think last week I wrote a short note on Substack about an interaction I had with a female founder. She's in women's health, of course. And she was sharing with me that she was at a pitch. She was pitching to a group of investors, and she actually spent most of the time explaining the female anatomy. And she didn't actually get enough time to actually pitch her product. So that is right. I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen. And it's a bit unfortunate when it's the founders who are actually having to make this education, because it distracts from actually talking about the product or the solution, which is the main reason why we're having the pitch. But I think it also speaks for the fact that I think we also need to get creative, because we talk about VC funding, but VC funding isn't the end all. There are other ways, and perhaps we need to get more creative in terms of, how do we bootstrap? How do we build this company to a certain level without having to, sort of depend on VC funding? So I think there's many elements to unraveling that puzzle. But as you say, it's step by step. I think we take baby steps in the right direction, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, the biggest obstacle is still kind of, which I didn't realize, because especially as my daughters are becoming adults, and some of the stories that I hear, which I think need to be highlighted, is like from 100 years ago. Like the one I hear constantly is that, this day and age, in allegedly like one of the most developed countries in the history of the world, we have a situation where a female founder wants to just have a normal pitch of her company, and obviously she's talking to a male venture capitalist, and very often the story goes like, oh, can we make it an informal pitch at 10 p.m. in a bar, something that should not be happening, this day and age. But this is like happening right now. I hear this kind of stories all the time, and we should just start with basically a simple narrative that it doesn't matter who you are, you just have to respect the person. It almost like we need to create a new culture for this venture capital, or maybe even, as you said, there are other ways to develop a company, there are other ways to finance, and maybe those ways need to be highlighted.
Absolutely. I want to take you to the article you wrote about the predictions for 25. I found that very interesting.
Oh boy.
It was about digital health in 2025, and it was titled Expect Massive Failures. What I loved about it, it was bold, it was grounded in data, of course. That is your signature, that is your style. But I think one of the predictions that really caught my eye was the AI tourist in healthcare. And you wrote that we need to move past, the AI tourist in healthcare. You mentioned the explosion of AI scribe companies, how much capital has flowed into models that feel nearly indistinguishable. I think you were also at the South by Southwest 25 conference earlier I think it was in February or March.
March, yeah.
March, okay, yes. And you were in a panel discussion, which was titled Most AI Startups Are Doomed. So I think what I wanted to talk to you about was, what do you think this tells us about where investor attention is going? And maybe where should it be going instead?
Yeah, that's a great question. The biggest story is where we are and how do we go forward as an industry, as innovators. Things change for venture capital investing in what I'm observing from data. In the past, no matter what your size was of your VC firm, you took it as a pride to communicate with your investors, but also with your customers, with the community, about what are you doing, what mistakes are you making, but also like where your successes are. I feel like that work that used to be put into talking to founders, finding out perhaps new innovations, it's almost like commoditized over time, and actually that contributed to deteriorating performance of many venture capital firms. And so what used to be in the past, okay, how do I find the most innovating startup and help the startup develop and help fix specific problems in the industry? Now it's more like, why bother if I'm in such a place in the industry, in the VC world, that I can just snap a company and then 2 years later sell it to the next guy, to sort of the highest bidder. If that's how the operation works, and that's what I'm observing actually, especially for larger firms, that's where the rest of the industry is going to suffer, and that's where innovation is going to suffer, because it's basically becoming this pump and dump scheme where you can just pick any company. And also velocity becomes an issue, this point that, the faster I can churn, the faster I can flip a company, the better off I am. And so it's becoming almost this kind of like street market operation. It's like, who do I sell next? As opposed to looking inside the companies, talking to founders. And that's becoming a big problem. You mentioned AI scribes. That's actually kind of interesting, because again, in my view, and I'm actually kind of in the middle of this series that I'm writing right now on the market.
Yeah.
And we also have this podcast that's should be out, I think, today, where Alex Koshikov, were able to gather, I think, very representative group. Like, if I wished somebody to talk about AI scribe market, this is probably some of the best people. So we actually talked about that. What's happening. We had a founder of Nabla, Alex LeBron. We had some people with really important voices in this industry, researchers, and so there are a lot of interesting questions being asked. And yes, one of them is actually the title of the podcast was, "Why the hell do we need 126 medical AI scripts?" And sure enough, a lot of them are basically knockoffs and wrappers of ChatGPT and other foundational models. Now, the reason all of them exist or I guess they've survived for so long is actually that goes to the heart of the problem, at least in my opinion. In the US, the system is very fragmented at the bottom, essentially where there is little or no money, and it's very monopolized the level of payers, PBMs, and EHR systems who are controlling that money pot. So at the bottom, you can actually exist for a while, and especially if you're connected to the VC world, you can exist for a long while. And it's because it's so fragmented. It's fragmented geographically, it's fragmented by levels, by the size of medical organizations. So you can actually find your niche even if you copy somebody else, which is very interesting development. Personally, I don't think it's sustainable even in this market, but those are kind of the reasons that we talked actually on podcast, and I'm going to discuss on my Substack as well, which is very interesting.
So I think just in terms of where investor attention should be going, I think one other thing that caught my attention from those predictions was, and which I was very excited about, was you said that 2025 could bring more meaningful innovation in biotech, pharma, AI, drug discovery. I mean, you didn't mention women's health explicitly in that post, but I think reading between the lines, especially if we think about how capital rewards loud voices over meaningful outcomes, I think it feels like women's health is part of the perfect example of where we could see meaningful innovation. I think, question from my side, are you seeing any early signs of that sort of shift?
It's interesting you mentioned women's health, because when I started looking into more detail, in fact, there are so many digital health companies in women's health and femtech that are actually doing well financially compared to traditionally men's sort of health companies. And that's kind of to me, that's the biggest paradox. And I just have no answer to that, because actually there's some research that's shown that in terms of IRR, internal rate of return, and other measures of performance, women-led companies actually outperform men-led companies on average. Yet 98% of venture capital goes to men-led companies.
Yes.
To me, that's the biggest paradox. It basically highlights the fact that I've been writing about, that it's all about who you know. It's all about this VC world and this VC conferences for like $10,000 that I can never get into, but they're charging so much for that. It's that world that dominates by men, despite of anything, despite of the facts and numbers, which to me was a little bit of a surprise initially, because I thought like a lot of it is, especially when you're, let's say, a limited partner like pension fund, invest in someone who used to perform well and then started to underperform, yet you never changed that investment thesis. You continue investing with the same guy, maybe because you've known that person. Essentially, there are many situations where limited partners are not performing their fiduciary duty for their own investors, who in many cases are like, ordinary people like teachers and firefighters, not doing anything, continue investing with underperforming venture capital funds. And to me, that's a big paradox. If nothing changes, of course, VC is gonna continue doing what they're doing. So they essentially continue being rewarded for underperformance. And to me, that's the biggest paradox. And I actually had a list of, there are not many women's companies, women health companies, unicorns, but there are a few. And I'm looking at the list, there are quite a few profitable companies. Progeny, Flow Health. I mean, it's hard to tell because it's a private company, like what exactly the numbers, but I hear stories like that they're very cost aware and kind of, penny pinching. And so it's funny, like how many sort of financial savvy stories I hear about inside those women's health companies that I don't hear, anywhere else. yet venture capital is going elsewhere. So to me, that's kind of the biggest problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point that you make. And I think there's one thing about also telling these stories. And that's why I'm personally very invested to ensure that where we have that first, that we can create the success stories within women's health. And then we can tell these stories and really make sure that, the allocators out there, the investors, the LPs, that they are aware of, the performance of some of these names, which maybe are overlooked by mainstream VC. And we can try to sort of rewrite those narratives. But it is indeed a paradox.
I raised my hand at that Philadelphia event, asked Sam Borowski of Maven Clinic. There are so many horrible stories about women's founders who basically start a great business, had a great idea, but then at some point just hitting that wall, or maybe not willing to have those 10 p.m. meetings, right? Because if you're a normal woman, like you're probably asking yourself, like, what am I doing here? And so they're starting, they're basically saying, okay, maybe this is not for me, which is horrible, And so I asked her, maybe we can learn from the success of Maven Clinic. Like,
Yes.
what did you guys do differently? And
Yes.
she was basically honest. She said, look, I have to give basically full credit to Kate Ryder because it's her baby. So
Yes.
it's just not right that to succeed in this world, being a great entrepreneur and innovator, it takes somebody like Kate Ryder basically being in the trenches for many years and sort of getting inside that man's world and therefore being able to kind of get something out of there. And I'm like, well, that's just not how it's supposed to be. I mean, I'm so happy for Kate and Maven and their success, but I think that narrative has to change. You don't have to be in the trenches of VC world for for
Yes.
so many years, for decades, to have a success. I mean, obviously that's not happening in the men's world. So we need to change that.
No, I fully agree. And that brings me to my next question that I had, which I wanted to get your thoughts on, which is really blind spots, where you see blind spots. I'll start with a couple that are top of mind for me. I think one area which I think is a blind spot with VC blind spots is cardiovascular disease in women. It's the leading cause of death. But I think if we look at diagnostic tools, we still are using male baselines. And in postpartum care, especially, cardiovascular risk is often missed entirely. So in my view, this is not just a care gap, that's a data blind spot. I've got two others. So autoimmune and menopause is, those are other two spots that I see. I think autoimmune, for me, that's really clear. There's, 80% of autoimmune patients are women. If we think endometriosis, lupus, Hashimoto's, and they're debilitating, they're expensive to manage and largely ignored by innovation capital. And I think if VCs actually mapped disease burden to opportunity, this would be a gold mine. Same thing for menopause. I think there's so much noise around cycle tracking and fertility. Like every other app out there is a cycle tracker. But I think the business case for menopause is quietly enormous. I mean, cognitive health, sleep, metabolic changes. And yet I feel like we're still funding content sites instead of full stack platforms. So those are my three that I think, VCs are missing at the moment. But what's maybe a blind spot that you're seeing, Sergey? A space you think is missed or maybe misunderstood by mainstream?
I think we've talked about this. I think you're a much better expert at women's health, so I'm not going to pretend here. So I'm going to kind of like go a little bit differently in like two
Mm-hmm.
areas. So first, outside of women's health, just what I'm dealing with on a daily basis. I think the biggest problem, and I said this so many times, if there is one company that created a business that would handle interoperability problem, which is basically providers connecting service company to EHR systems, which is now, despite all the talk, despite all the legal framework that been passed over the last, well, now it's like 3 decades, there are still great issues. And this is the biggest, well, I guess one of the biggest problems that exist for, I would say, areas like primary care, where all those organizations, a lot of them, by the way, here in the US, still independent, although they're not as many as they used to be. And so they're dealing with like issues, why are we still using like even faxes in certain point? Like why in this day and age where we have so many developments, all this great AI, why can't I simply get a record for my patient digitally and like put it on a system and maybe process it and give my patients some insights? So that is still this day and age in America the biggest problem, in my opinion, on a sort of technology front. If there was a company that basically said, you know what, we're gonna do all that. There are a lot of intermediaries that are kind of promising, and actually quite a few of those. They're in business of like promising, like providing APIs to EHR systems, but no one actually delivered, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's, again, to me, that's kind of big pain point here in the US healthcare. On women's health, it's interesting. There's one company I want to highlight, not on women's health, but in kind of asking some of these questions and getting answers. There is a company called Open Evidence that are on a kind of rip right now in the US. It is exponentially being popularized, which is funny because kind of the idea that my co-founder and I had when we started our startup. But basically, that's how I got to the second part of my answer. Hopefully, I'm going to get there, which is where are the biggest disparity in women's conditions according to research. So there's a company called Open Evidence that essentially, it's not a new idea, but I think they may have had a better handle on that. So they basically, at least according to them, have the richest sort of data set or combination of data sets of medical studies. And they came up with this AI that kind of quickly and with very precise references could answer any question. So like in my case, let's say I didn't know much about women's conditions, so I can just go and ask, give me fact-based empirical answer, where are the biggest disparities in which women's conditions. It gave me a few answers, so I'm just going to kind of read through this. So you mentioned a few conditions and actually have, I feel like, very good references. So fibromyalgia is another condition that's very prevalent in women, but are very heavily underfunded. Chronic fatigue syndrome, obviously migraines, and PCOS. So according to the research, and I have specific numbers, which I'm not going to mention, but definitely compared to other areas, grossly underfunded, but very sort of specific and very important to women's health. And so I think those are areas that we need to address. So what's interesting is that, and I think that's the biggest problem, monetization that we've had actually over the last couple of years, it's been in men's health. So companies like Raw Health and Hims and Hers, in case of Hims and Hers, they claim they provide various tools, various drugs for both men and women. But if you look at their revenue, it's actually very, even before this GLP-1, craziness, it was heavily men's health based. Whether it's Viagra-based products or whatever, most of the revenue comes from men, and so that's kind of another interesting thing. So, and that's, I think, transfers to the thinking of venture capitalists. They're like, well, it looks like we can make most of the money in men's health, so let's just ignore women's health altogether. And I think this is the wrong thinking, and I think we need to change that narrative.
Sergei, thank you so much. That was really incredible. And I fully agree. PCOS is actually it's so under-researched and underfunded. And it's so prevalent among women. I'm going to check out Open Evidence, but that is so right. That is actually spot on. And I fully agree with that. Thank you so much for the conversation and for your time. For me, this was really a joy. We've tried to kind of get this call in. When I reached out to you on Substack, we're like, yep, let's do it. So thank you so much. To our listeners, if this episode made you pause, if it made you think or smile, then share it with a founder or an investor. Leave us a review. It helps more people find us. And definitely, I can only highly recommend go subscribe to AI Health Uncut. It's the one newsletter that I go to when I want to see past the noise. Sergei doesn't play games. He doesn't sugarcoat. This is exactly why his insights really cut deeper. And if you're a founder listening to this, listen to Sergei's take and it resonated, drop him a message on LinkedIn. He's super responsive. But just double check the spelling of his name before you hit send.
I want to highlight your Substack as well, FemmeHealth Venture Alliance, is that?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy reading that. And I think you're getting a lot of traffic there, and I'm so happy for you. I mean, people really love your stuff.
Thank you so much. It's at first when I saw the traffic coming in, Sergei, I must admit, I thought maybe I need to go and hide under a digital rock or something. But
I don't know how you're doing it, but yeah, no, continue, please. I'm so happy for you.
thank you so much. And thank you everyone for listening, and keep investing in the future you want to live in. See you next time. Bye. That's it for this episode of Blindspot Capital. If you learned something, share it. And if you're building something, reach out. And if you're investing in the future, make sure you're not doing it blind.